BLOCKTV. It's time now for Hodel with Hedel, a chance to zoom out for a moment and take a wider perspective on some of the heady issues that dominate the crypto markets as a whole. And to guide us on this journey of discovery, we're joined by Bitcoin influencer and thought leader Dan Held. Dan, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks again for having me.
All right, so to kick us off this week, it's the story dominating mainstream news headlines, impacting markets around the world, potentially causing panic, fear, and concern everywhere. Of course, I'm talking about the coronavirus, the potential pandemic making its way through China and much of the world. And Dan, this has had a significant impact on global markets, the way people have reacted. There were big downturns out of Asia. We saw last week massive downturns in US equity markets. And at the same time, we've been seeing cryptocurrencies climbing. Correlation, causation. Dan, what are your thoughts on how this potential pandemic could impact the crypto markets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, it's always tough to parse out in markets what is causation. So what technically influenced the other? Did coronavirus influence crypto markets? Did it influence mainstream markets? I think in the mainstream markets, it's pretty easy to see that. We see very distinctive declines in the market that are very much news driven or driven by this catalyst, which is the coronavirus. Crypto market, due to the high volatility, is somewhat hard to parse out. But crypto has been built. Crypto has been handcrafted to be well situated for events where critical infrastructure is shut down or people are really concerned about the living conditions or future economic environment. So, Bitcoin being built as that store of value, safe haven asset, I think it's certainly possible that we see it start to rise with raises, as concerns over the coronavirus increase. But I think so far we haven't seen like a super clear causation that Bitcoin has jumped based on coronavirus. Not like what we saw with Iran, where there was direct price movement with news that came out, and that came out that that price movement was down to almost the second or minute versus this, which I think is kind of more indicative of like a bigger trend. For instance, over the last couple of days, Bitcoin has actually dropped.
Mm-hmm. So, then sort of playing devil's advocate for a moment here, let's sort of step into the safe haven narrative shoes for a moment, because there are those out there, certain analysts and sort of thinkers who would say that Bitcoin, as strong as it is, hasn't yet taken on a full, risk-off asset classification yet, particularly in the minds of some of those big players, those big institutional investors that potentially want to or are beginning to enter the crypto markets. Do you think that it has, and do you think that Bitcoin is in a strong enough place now that should, this coronavirus scare turn into a full-blown pandemic or something more serious, do you think it has the chops to really take on that risk-off asset and that hedging asset that people are going to start flooding money into at times of global economic turndown?
That's a great question. And I kind of agree with some of your more mainstream analysis that Bitcoin isn't that just yet. I think Bitcoin is a speculative store of value, as Jerome Powell from the Federal Reserve puts it. And I think in moments where, like with Iran, we see it move up on the exact minute of some of that news being announced. But with like the coronavirus, we see a drop. So I think we're seeing a glimmer that it could become a store of value, a safe haven asset during times of volatility and turmoil. But that is not yet recognized by the mainstream finance or a majority of the world. It's just recognized by a small group of individuals. Bitcoin hodlers are estimated to be, under 100 million. So it's a very small group of people who feel that way. But hence why there is potential for price appreciation with Bitcoin is that when the rest of the world wakes up to Bitcoin's promise, that eventually it steps into those shoes of being a safe haven asset for everyone.
All right, well, an important question there then about how we get, sort of say, the next billion people into crypto, how we get that mass adoption. And that question is being addressed, at least in some form, on the platform Twitter at the moment, with the new Bitcoin hashtag now getting its own hash flag, the Bitcoin B, making its way into the hashtag, pumped out there by Jack Dorsey, CEO and founder of Twitter itself. Dan, what significance does a move like this have for the industry? Purely symbolic, or genuinely a step towards a bigger and brighter future for Bitcoin?
Well, I think Jack represented a really important tech CEO to endorse Bitcoin and be Bitcoin only. Jack has a lot of influence and is sort of a legend in Silicon Valley. He's one of the rare few co-founders who is simultaneously managing two publicly traded companies at the same time. I think Elon Musk is the only one with the same sort of notoriety. And so Jack really represents, I think his background too. I think a lot of people really respect Jack. I haven't heard a lot of negativity about him or his management style. And that's pretty rare given how long he's operated in Silicon Valley. So I think, Jack endorsing and putting out something like this for Bitcoin, a little Bitcoin flag, if you will, is a really good nod to the community and a nod to the commitment that he has to Bitcoin. In the mainstream world, I'm not sure how much this means. I'm not sure if this really is going to be something that causes Bitcoin to ignite in popularity. But I do think it's a reaffirmation of Jack's commitment to Bitcoin, and it's a very nice nod, a very subtle, not so subtle, a very small but appreciated nod towards the Bitcoin community. And I think we saw that outpouring on Twitter a few days ago with just everyone tweeting the Bitcoin hashtag. A lot of takes on that too, where people were doing, hashtag Bitcoin Cash with a pile of, a pile of poop next to it, or, hashtag Ethereum with like a unicorn. So it was a pretty fun day on crypto Twitter.
It certainly was a fun day, and as we saw on that day, the Bitcoin hashtag made its way all the way up to 18th spot in terms of overall trending hashtags on Twitter. A pretty steep climb for, as we say, is still a relatively niche asset out there in the industry, before being bumped, however, by, of course, none other than the Super Bowl itself and all the hashtags that were related to that. Now, I know this is something a bit close to your heart in some ways, Dan. Why is it that crypto doesn't yet have any sort of representation at the Super Bowl or other major global sporting events?
I believe there has been one crypto Super Bowl commercial, but I'm forgetting about the year. Bitcoin and crypto is still a very niche industry. Like I said before, I think there's under 100 million hodlers out there in the world, and that's probably a very much an overestimate. And because of that industry being so small, there's not a ton of reasons why someone would go spend, I forget what the current going rate of a Super Bowl ad is, maybe it's $1 million every 10 seconds or something. But there's that's a very hard thing to measure. A lot of the brands that you see advertising in the Super Bowl, they're very, very large brands who can commit, $5 to $10 million to a Super Bowl ad, and their annual budget for marketing is maybe $1 billion. So it's more of a rounding error. This is like the Coca-Colas out there, versus there's something called performance marketing, which performance marketing is where you track every single piece of information. For example, you pay for Google search ads, and Google tracks how many people see the ad versus click on the ad, and then you as the marketer track everything from the click to an install to a sign up to an action inside of the product. So the amount that you spend is very trackable. The ROI and spend are very much able to be tied together. And with a Super Bowl ad, I think the spend on that is extremely difficult to measure and also do it in a way that would be profitable. And so I think we're only going to see Super Bowl ads for crypto companies probably either in the next bubble or maybe a little bit after that, with maybe companies like Twitter or Square deciding to go shave off a little bit of their budget for it.
So now it's an interesting point, though, about Bitcoin in particular, and this is something I've spoken about with a lot of our guests here on BLOCKTV, but the idea that despite the power of Bitcoin through its decentralization, there is inherently a bit of a marketing limitation that comes from not having a central head, a central body. So despite the Bitcoin industry itself being worth, Bitcoin itself currently, its market cap stands at around $170 billion. It doesn't have a central point, and it's a bit of a, I don't know if to call a tragedy of the commons, but certainly, this idea that a given company would have to take that incentive to go out and put a Super Bowl commercial themselves, something they may have an incentive to do if they hodl a lot of Bitcoin and or have interest in the industry. But again, without that central body, it kind of disincentivizes some. Do you think that that's a concern for Bitcoin from a marketing perspective as a whole, or will its advantages outweigh its disadvantages?
That's a really good question that I feel like a lot of people haven't thought about. Bitcoin actually has a unique situation, right, where it's this decentralized protocol. There's no really centralization around direction or marketing efforts. But what Bitcoin does have is a decentralized marketing team. The #1 user acquisition channel, and channel refers to sort of like where you acquire them through. And the #1 user acquisition channel for Bitcoin is word of mouth. Word of mouth from you to your friends, from you to your parents, from you to your significant other. And so Bitcoin actually has a decentralized marketing team where that marketing team goes out and person to person converts them into becoming a Bitcoiner. Now, of course, price and speculation is a huge draw as well that pulls in many, many people. But typically, if someone is curious about Bitcoin and the price is starting to moon, they're going to ask someone they know who had gotten into Bitcoin previously to tell them about it. So, just because the price goes up doesn't necessarily mean the person converts into becoming a Bitcoiner. That piques their interest. And then they need to be connected with a Bitcoiner to walk them through the different steps and to really guide them. And so Bitcoin's marketing is essentially each one of us coming up with our own story and our own narrative to convert someone into becoming a Bitcoiner. And if you do it well, like an individual like Saifedean or others in the space who write great content for newbies, if you do that well, then you earn money. Because if you get people into Bitcoin, then people really want to recommend your content to other people. And then that potentially gives you a potential for profit, whether that be selling a book, selling a media appearance, or other things like consulting. So Bitcoin really has its own marketing team of millions of Bitcoiners who each are incentivized to pull in more and more believers.
So spreading the gospel of Bitcoin through word of mouth, would you say, is sort of the key to the success of Bitcoin's future, that grassroots impetus rather than the top-down effect that we see of so many other comparative asset classes?
Definitely. I mean, just inherently due to the nature of how Bitcoin works, it's impossible to have that centralized marketing team. So each individual has to, take whatever content they can and go out there and prophesize what they feel is the merits of Bitcoin. Certainly a lot of people don't feel like doing that, and that's totally fine. It's just for those who feel that kind of burning passion to talk about it, and that's really what took Bitcoin from zero to now, and what will take it from however many hodlers there are now to hundreds of millions or billions of hodlers.
All right, certainly a giant leap for us to take forward as an industry, one that word of mouth is so important to spread. It's up to the individuals in the sphere. Dan Held, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us today about these key issues across the space at the moment. So much developing, so much happening. So keep watching at blocktv.com for all the latest in news and information. I'm westropp-evans. Thanks for watching.
For more news and updates, follow us on Twitter.